The morning everything fractured began without drama, without thunder, without any cinematic warning that my 34-year marriage was about to collapse under the weight of its own quiet deceit. I was seated in the upstairs study of the colonial house I had purchased long before vows and shared bank accounts complicated ownership, reviewing a procurement analysis for a private aerospace firm that still valued my 3 decades of experience in strategic logistics. My career had been built on anticipating breakdowns before they occurred, rerouting shipments through unstable regions, reinforcing weak links in global supply chains, designing redundancies so that if one artery failed, 3 others compensated instantly. I had spent most of my adult life operating in environments where mistakes cost lives and oversight invited catastrophe. Calm, deliberate planning had never been a personality quirk, it had been survival. That Tuesday morning, sunlight angled across the hardwood floors in disciplined stripes while the kettle hissed in the kitchen below. The house was silent except for the faint hum of my desktop tower and the measured ticking of the antique regulator clock mounted near the bookcase. Then my phone vibrated against the desk. The message came from my nephew, Elias. "You might want to screenshot Marin's profile before it gets deleted." My fingers went cold before my mind processed the implication. I opened the app. There she was, my wife, the woman who once accused me of lacking passion, draped across a teak lounge chair beside an infinity pool that bled into turquoise water. A white linen wrap clung to her shoulders. Her head leaned against a broad chest I recognized immediately. Nalin Pierce, the college flame she had dismissed for decades as immature and directionless. The caption beneath the image read, "Life begins when you stop settling." They were laughing. My wife's left hand, still bearing the ring I had purchased after 3 months of overtime consulting work in my early 30s, rested possessively on his thigh. I stared at the screen. My coffee cooled. Something inside me cooled faster. I did not shout. I did not throw the phone. I simply inhaled the way I had before briefing rooms and crisis meetings and opened my laptop. For years Marin had described me as predictable, as structured to a fault. She mistook my caution for timidity, my organization for monotony. She wanted unpredictability, spontaneity, the kind of cinematic chaos that looks romantic on filtered screens. What she failed to understand was that structured men do not crumble when provoked. They recalibrate. Within 4 minutes I had accessed our shared financial dashboards. Within 8, I had isolated every joint asset. Years earlier, after watching her spiral into anxiety when her mother faced unexpected surgery, I had established layered financial partitions, separate accounts under her name for security, joint accounts for household liquidity, independent reserves under my sole authority. I believed I was protecting her from instability. Instead, I had unintentionally created a system that now protected me. I transferred precisely 50% of the liquid balance from the shared savings into my private trust account, documenting timestamps automatically. I deactivated the joint credit line currently underwriting her tropical rebellion. I suspended automated payments attached to her personal subscriptions. Streaming platforms, cloud storage, boutique delivery services she claimed were small indulgences. I left one essential policy untouched, vehicle insurance, because consequences should unfold gradually, not explosively. My phone began ringing almost immediately. Her sister, ignored, then her mother, ignored. I was not angry. Anger is inefficient. It clouds judgment and accelerates error. I was methodical. I was measured. She wanted an exhilarating narrative arc. I was about to provide a procedural reality. Over the next hour, I combed through transaction histories dating back half a year. Patterns emerged like faint footprints in wet sand once you know where to look. A jewelry boutique 40 miles away where she had never mentioned shopping. An upscale bistro located in the same district where Nalin maintained a consulting office. Spa appointments charged twice in 1 week under a package labeled Couples Immersion. Receipts told stories she believed would remain unread. She had underestimated 2 things, my patience and my archival instincts. I documented every anomaly, exporting PDFs into encrypted folders labeled neutrally, but organized with surgical precision. Then I retrieved an old email confirmation for a coastal villa reservation I had arranged months earlier for what I thought would be a renewal anniversary trip. She had used the itinerary, my itinerary, with him. I dialed the resort's administrative office. My tone remained courteous as I informed them that the card on file had been compromised and must be removed immediately. I declined to provide replacement payment details. She is fully capable of managing her own expenses, I explained evenly. The representative hesitated, then complied. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair. The dust motes in the sunlight seemed suspended in time. There are moments when a life divides into before and after. This was one of them. That evening my son, Callum, arrived without warning. He wore fatigues, having secured emergency leave the moment my niece forwarded him the screenshots. He did not ask how I felt. He asked, "What's the strategy?" Pride moved through me like a quiet current. I outlined the financial separation, the documentation, the communication freeze. He listened without interruption, nodding once. Then I walked to the wall safe embedded behind a framed aerial map from one of my early overseas assignments. Inside lay a velvet pouch containing a pair of antique silver cufflinks engraved with the initials of my grandfather, who had carried them during a decisive campaign on foreign soil generations earlier. They were not valuable for their metal content. They were valuable for their story. I had checked the safe 2 nights prior while organizing estate documents. The pouch had been missing. I replayed interior security footage stored on a discrete server. The video showed Marin entering my office 3 weeks before her departure, unlocking the safe, removing the pouch and slipping it into her handbag. Callum's jaw tightened. "She took them," he said. I nodded. "She miscalculated," I corrected. "Theft of marital property is one matter. Theft of generational legacy is another entirely." Messages from her began arriving before midnight. "My card isn't working. There must be a bank error. Answer me." I allowed silence to perform its work. The following morning, the resort manager contacted me directly, explaining that outstanding charges had exceeded several thousand and that absent payment, room access would be restricted. I clarified that I was not financially responsible for an adult traveling independently. Later that afternoon, an official email arrived from a governmental oversight bureau associated with clearance-linked benefits I once held. Evidently, Marin had used residual dependent travel privileges attached to my former credentials to secure premium upgrades and facility access. The inquiry was formal but restrained. I provided a full statement within the hour, attaching documentation of unauthorized usage. This was not vengeance. It was compliance with institutional procedure. By the 3rd day, her social media presence vanished. Nolan, meanwhile, had posted a gym selfie back home captioned with some banal commentary about fresh starts. My daughter, Leora, who possessed sharp analytical instincts from her legal training, compiled a digital dossier of every post, receipt, and correspondence. "If this escalates," she said quietly, "we're prepared." She was correct. 3 days later, the resort informed me that Marin had attempted to depart without settling her account. Security intervened. She demanded they contact me. I reiterated my position. Her liabilities were her own. Calls from extended family intensified. Accusations of cruelty followed. I remained consistent. "Consequences are not cruelty," I told her brother when he accused me of abandonment. "They are arithmetic." Meanwhile, the Oversight Bureau notified me that her misuse of credential-linked benefits constituted a violation subject to financial penalty and travel restrictions pending review. I neither celebrated nor gloated. I updated my attorney. Papers were drafted. The house, titled solely in my name from purchase decades earlier, was quietly listed and sold within weeks. Proceeds were distributed into irrevocable trusts for Callum and Leora. By the time Marin returned home, economy class, unaccompanied, she discovered that the narrative she had curated online had dissolved into legal paperwork awaiting her at baggage claim. When she finally called, her voice was stripped of defiance. She asked where I was. I informed her I had relocated. She asked about the house. I explained the sale was lawful and final. Silence filled the line when I mentioned the security footage and the civil complaint drafted against Nolan for receipt of stolen property. "How did you know?" she whispered. "I verify," I replied. Nolan returned the cufflinks within 48 hours after reviewing the evidence. He signed a sworn affidavit acknowledging receipt under false pretenses. I stored the heirlooms in a secured deposit box the same afternoon. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly thereafter. Her petition for spousal support was dismissed in light of documented misconduct and financial fraud. 97 days after filing, the decree was entered. There was no celebration, only closure. In the months that followed, updates reached me indirectly. Administrative fines had been imposed. Employment consequences followed. Social circles shifted. I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only equilibrium restored. One evening my niece messaged that my grandmother, were she alive, would have approved of the composure with which I handled adversity. I considered that carefully. Dignity is not loud. It does not demand witnesses. It is the quiet refusal to become what wronged you. Spring arrived early the following year. The air carried that subtle warmth that signals renewal without fanfare. Leora introduced me to a colleague from her hospital department, a woman named Helena with silver threaded through dark hair and laughter unburdened by performance. She did not ask for spectacle. She valued steadiness. We spoke over coffee about mountain trails and archival documentaries, about grown children and second chapters. There was no urgency, no theatrics, just presence. 8 months after that photograph by the infinity pool detonated my marriage, I stood on a ridge overlooking an expanse of rolling green with Helena's hand resting lightly in mine. There was no caption, no audience, no filtered declaration about refusing to settle. There was simply the quiet understanding that excitement does not reside in chaos. It resides in clarity. I had spent decades designing contingencies for crises across continents. I never expected the most significant one would unfold at my own breakfast table. Yet here I was, intact, heirlooms reclaimed, children steady at my side, future unclouded. Some things are worth defending. Some lessons are worth the cost. And sometimes the most decisive victory is not retaliation, but restraint refined into action. The ridge where Helena and I stood that afternoon overlooked a valley threaded with late-season wildflowers, the kind that bloom quietly without demanding admiration. The wind moved in deliberate currents, bending tall grass in synchronized waves, and I found myself reflecting on how different this silence felt from the manufactured stillness that used to hang in my old house before arguments that never fully surfaced. Helena did not press for explanations about my past, nor did she pretend indifference. She possessed the rare balance of curiosity without intrusion. We spoke in measured exchanges about rebuilding, not as a dramatic reinvention but as a disciplined restoration. I told her that my life had never been about spectacle. It had been about systems, structures that hold under pressure. She smiled and said, "Systems fail when someone inside them decides they don't want stability anymore." It was the first time anyone had articulated the fracture so plainly without assigning blame theatrically. Later that evening, as we descended from the overlook and the sky shifted into muted amber, my phone buzzed. A notification from my attorney. Marin's counsel was contesting asset distribution despite the court's findings. I showed Helena. She didn't react with alarm. "Will it change anything?" she asked calmly. "No," I replied. "It will cost her more money and produce the same outcome." Helena nodded once as if that closed the matter. That steadiness, no rush of adrenaline, no impulse toward outrage, felt foreign and deeply welcome. The weeks that followed were procedural. Marin's appeal was brief and largely symbolic. The appellate review upheld the original decree without modification. Legal documentation arrived with the unemotional language court's favor, concise, definitive, devoid of commentary. My attorney confirmed there would be no further hearings unless she initiated entirely new claims, which seemed financially improbable given the penalties she had already incurred from the benefits investigation. I archived the documents both digitally and physically, placing copies in a fireproof cabinet, alongside estate materials and trust declarations for Callum and Leora. My children visited often during that period, not because I required supervision, but because cohesion had become instinctual. Callum would sit across from me at the dining table reviewing his own long-term financial planning, occasionally asking about investment diversification. Leora updated me on her hospital's compliance cases, laughing at bureaucratic absurdities with a sharp wit that reminded me of her grandmother. Neither mentioned their mother unless necessary. The absence of bitterness in our conversations signaled something important. We had processed the rupture without allowing it to metastasize into permanent resentment. One afternoon, a registered letter arrived bearing a return address I did not recognize. Inside was a handwritten note from Marin. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, angular, controlled, as though each letter required effort. She did not apologize in dramatic language. She did not plead for reconciliation. Instead, she wrote about miscalculation, about mistaking comfort for confinement, about confusing steadiness with stagnation. She admitted Nolan had severed contact entirely once the investigation escalated, and that the isolation she experienced abroad forced her to confront the reality that the excitement she pursued had been performative rather than sustaining. I read the letter twice. There was a time when such words might have unraveled me. Now they felt informational rather than destabilizing. I did not respond, not out of cruelty, but because engagement would reopen channels deliberately sealed. Closure is fragile if revisited carelessly. Helena and I continued seeing each other without labeling the progression. We attended a chamber orchestra performance one Friday, where she leaned toward me during a quiet passage and whispered observations about tempo shifts with a technical appreciation I found unexpectedly captivating. On another evening, we prepared dinner together. Nothing elaborate, just roasted vegetables and salmon. Yet the simplicity of shared tasks felt intimate in a way extravagant vacations never had. She asked once whether I regretted handling the situation with such severity. I considered that question seriously. Severity implies excess, I answered. What I did was proportionate. She accepted that without debate. In that acceptance lay mutual respect. There was no appetite for drama between us, only clarity. Meanwhile, news of Marin's professional consequences filtered indirectly through acquaintances. Her previous employer had terminated her position quietly after the federal citation became public record. She had relocated to a smaller apartment across town and reportedly taken temporary contract work unrelated to her prior field. I felt no surge of vindication. The justice system had functioned as designed. My role had been documentation and restraint. Anything beyond that would have been indulgence. One evening, Callum mentioned running into Nolan at a conference center gym. According to him, Nolan avoided eye contact and left abruptly. He looks thinner, Callum observed. Stress does that, I replied evenly. The cufflinks remained secured in a bank vault, removed only once to photograph for insurance revaluation. I held them briefly in my palm that day, feeling their cool weight. Legacy restored. Continuity preserved. As summer approached, Helena invited me to meet her two sons during a casual backyard gathering. They were intelligent men in their 30s, one a history teacher, the other a civil engineer. Conversation flowed naturally, without interrogation. At one point, the engineer asked about my years coordinating logistics across volatile regions. I described the necessity of contingency mapping, how every plan includes an alternate route and a tertiary fallback. He nodded thoughtfully and said, "Most people don't plan their personal lives that way." I almost laughed. "Most people assume permanence where none is guaranteed," I replied. Later, as the evening cooled and string lights flickered above us, Helena's younger son raised a toast, not to romance, not to new beginnings, but to resilience. The word resonated more deeply than celebration ever could. The anniversary of the day I first saw that photograph arrived without ceremony. I noticed the date only because it appeared on a document header I was reviewing. There was no spike of anger, no ache of humiliation, only recognition that 12 months had passed and the architecture of my life now looked entirely different. I spent that evening on my balcony overlooking the city skyline, reflecting on the paradox that what began as betrayal ultimately clarified what endurance truly means. Helena joined me with 2 glasses of red wine. We did not discuss the past. We discussed upcoming travel, modest, intentional trips rather than extravagant escapes. "I prefer places where the pace forces you to slow down," she said. I agreed. Chaos had never attracted me. Deliberate movement had. Autumn returned with crisp air and shifting leaves. Leora closed on her first home using funds from the trust distribution. Watching her sign, those papers felt more satisfying than any courtroom outcome. Callum received a promotion within his unit, citing discipline and composure under pressure, traits I recognized instantly. That evening, as the family gathered in Leora's new living room surrounded by unpacked boxes and mismatched chairs, I realized that the legacy I valued most was not contained in metal heirlooms, but in the habits my children carried forward: patience, verification, integrity under strain. Helena sat beside me quietly, observing the dynamic without intrusion. She fit not by force but by alignment. Late one night, months after the legal dust had settled, my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. It was Marin. Her voice was measured, lacking the desperation of previous calls. She informed me she had entered counseling and was restructuring her finances. There was no request for assistance, only an update delivered in neutral tone. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I wished her stability, nothing more. The call ended without hostility. I felt something unexpected, not forgiveness exactly, but completion. The final loose thread tied without spectacle. Winter approached again, carrying the kind of quiet that magnifies reflection. Helena and I traveled to a small mountain town where snow blanketed rooftops in undisturbed white. We walked through narrow streets lined with lanterns, speaking about future possibilities without urgency. Commitment, if it arrived, would not be born from fear of loneliness or reaction to betrayal. It would be chosen deliberately, with eyes open. Standing there beneath falling snow, I understood something that had eluded me during the height of my marriage's unraveling. Excitement is not the opposite of stability. It is the product of trust maintained over time. I had defended what mattered, relinquished what did not, and emerged neither hardened nor diminished, simply clarified. And in that clarity, I found a version of myself that required no audience, no vindication, only quiet forward motion.